Celeste is a game which succeeds in every possible aspect. I mean, the game's artwork is beautiful. Every single level takes you to a brand new environment and looks completely unique and distinct from the last. The level design is completely pristine. Every stage introduces new mechanics, all of which are simple enough that they're easy to learn, but they're still interesting because they're used in such creative ways. Celeste is challenging, but it also never crushes the player. It sets the bar unacceptably high, but it's also always helping you out, with several mechanics that exist to remove the tedium that is so associated with difficult games. Celeste's story is simple, but it's incredibly meaningful as well. Madeline's suicidal journey of self-acceptance is one which is easy for anyone who has struggled with anxiety or depression to relate to. Celeste is also a shining star of the LGBT community, with several members on the team being proudly transgender, and the main character, Madeline, is one of the only trans women ever in games. And the soundtrack, completely beyond insane. I mean, they call Lena Raine the melody mage. That doesn't do her music. That's not good enough. There's a quote I really like which goes, "Lena's music is deceptively simple," and by that I mean it isn't simple at all. But it's all these things I just listed: the level design, artwork, challenge, story, representation, and mind-blowing soundtrack. These are the things that people think of when you talk about Celeste. This is what game journalists and reviewers will praise Celeste on, and if you've played the game, these are probably the things that you remember most about it. Which is why I'm not going to talk about any of them. Celeste has the most satisfying and expressive core moveset of any 2D platformer. And I mean any. The game only gives the player 3 tools: the jump, the dash, and the wall cling, but they are all so fleshed out that the core gameplay becomes as deep and expressive as 3D platformers, like 64 or Odyssey, which is very impressive because these games have a whole other dimension to work with. I mean, let's just talk about Celeste for a second. You can jump, and you can dash, then you can jump into a dash, which brings you further, or you can dash into a jump, which accelerates the player, and if you dash diagonally into a jump, you gain less height, but go even faster, and if you time the jump correctly, you regain the dash again while in the air. But timing the jump correctly requires a runway to do, and if you don't have one, then you can dash backwards and then jump forwards to regain the momentum and the dash, and you can perform a hyper from the air by dashing into the ground and jumping right away, and if you chain these together, you get to incredible speeds. The amount of ways you can get from point A to point B is insane, and that is just scratching the surface of what the dash and jump can do, without even mentioning the climbing. But if you played Celeste casually, you might be confused as to why I'm complimenting it on its expressiveness, because most of the game feels like you can only beat it in a very specific single way. This is due to the game's level design, which is very limiting in how it lets you use the tools. For all the ways that you can combine them, the game only ever asks you to jump into a dash to beat most of the levels. Majority of the stages are designed around only the most basic use of the core tools. Eventually, they do introduce some of the more advanced mechanics, but they're taught in such a harsh and thoughtless manner. Ultimately, a game would ease the player into the more advanced techniques because they can be difficult to perform, but Celeste expects you to be able to replicate them consistently the moment you learn of their existence.
It's not working.
Now, the advanced movements aren't that difficult, but they do require practice, and because they are introduced so suddenly halfway through a level, it means that the player has to stop playing in order to practice a new technique. There's just no reason that the learning curve has to be so steep. It would not have been difficult to introduce the advanced mechanics more gradually to the player, as this is how every other mechanic is introduced in Celeste. You get an example of how it works at the beginning of the level, and then it gets more and more complex alongside the player's understanding of how the mechanic works. So by the time Celeste is asking you to do crazy stuff, you're already more than comfortable enough with the tools to be able to. But even once you get accustomed to using the advanced movements, you're often discouraged from using them by the level design. This is because almost every obstacle in the game has a set way it wants you to solve it, and trying to do it a different way is very unintuitive. For example, look at this room. What the game wants you to do is dash up here, then jump into the bubble, then go across. And now, if you know the advanced movements, you can go across like this. But this is hard to do. No one's ever going to play like this in a normal playthrough, because it's a very unintuitive movement. It's not really how the game expects you to tackle it. Now, compare this to a game like Mario Odyssey, which is designed around exploiting and highlighting the fun that comes from creative movement. The levels in that game exist as jungle gyms for the player to simply enjoy moving around in, which becomes fun to do because the core movement is incredibly deep, just like Celeste's is. The reason that Odyssey is a freeing and expressive game, while Celeste often isn't, is because the levels in Odyssey encourage the player to exploit its own movement. The challenges you are presented with are simple and aren't particularly difficult to complete, but they are placed in such a devious and thoughtful manner that the player can't help get creative. For example, look at this wall. You can go and mess around in the 2D section, or if you're good, then you can just jump straight up and ignore the 2D section. Or if you're really good, you don't even have to go up there at all.
Oh, no. What?
Every obstacle in the game has been meticulously crafted to have this level of flexibility, which is why the game is so conducive of challenge runs. Mario Odyssey, but the floor is lava. Mario Odyssey, but you can't jump. Mario Odyssey, but you can't walk. The designers knew that the player would push the mechanics of the game to their absolute limits, and were more than happy to build the levels with that in mind. Now, Celeste obviously also has moments like this. For example, the entire first level can be beaten without dashing at all, but the game is so linear that the player isn't encouraged to get this creative. This is not a criticism of Celeste, because Celeste is very intentionally a linear platformer. If Mario Odyssey's levels are designed to be a jungle gym, which is fun to play around in, then Celeste's are designed to be a cliff face, which is tough to overcome. This cliff face design is why Celeste doesn't give the player much freedom, because freedom would reduce the challenge. In games, the more freedom that you have, the greater your ability to avoid difficult moments in the game, which is why the hardest games are always completely linear. In Celeste, if there's a room you're really struggling with, you don't have any other choice to keep trying until you win. Whereas in Mario Odyssey, if there's something you're really struggling to do, then you can simply choose to do something else that you find easier. Now, Celeste is trying to be challenging, and its cliff face design perfectly fits the story and themes of the game, so I'm not criticizing Celeste when I say it limits the player. It does this very intentionally, and it doesn't make any sense to criticize something for achieving what it set out to do. It's like if I said Dark Souls was bad because it was too hard. It's trying to be hard, that's the whole point. So any complaints I made about its difficulty would only affirm the developers that they've achieved their goal. So, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with Celeste. The game is amazing, but how it's currently designed does leave some interesting untapped potential. Celeste's core mechanics are so deep that it's almost a waste to put them in such a linear game. They're more than interesting enough to sustain a platformer with a more freeing and expressive design, similar to a game like Mario Odyssey, but in 2D. Of course, designing the actual levels for a Celeste Odyssey would be an insane task, much more difficult than it would be to create deep enough tools in the first place. But it still means that a large portion of the work is already done for you, especially with how powerful and accessible Celeste's map-making tools are. Now, when creating a sandbox platformer, the main thing you have to focus on is getting a good balance between fluidity and freedom, which is a difficult thing to do because they are two contradicting design goals. The easiest way to create a satisfying flow is to make the game linear, because then you only have to account for a single path when designing. But obviously, if you make it linear, then you're sacrificing the player's freedom. The player has to be able to choose what they want to do, so we have to have a large variety of objectives that they can pursue in any order. But this is a very hard thing to do, because every objective you add has to link up with every existing objective in a satisfying manner. This gets harder and harder to do the more objectives you add, because you have to account for more and more connections each time. This problem of connection makes it very difficult to make a sandbox level really large, because you only have to get to about 10 objectives before you're dealing with over 100 connections that you have to manage all at once. This is a very difficult design problem, but fortunately for us, there's already several solutions to this that we can just copy from existing games. Let's start with the king of platformers, Mario Odyssey, which has a system where after you have completed the game, a moon rock appears in every level, which repopulates that level with new collectibles. This means that every single level has a large amount of total objectives, but the game still maintains a good flow because the developers only had to account for the pacing of half of the objectives at a time, rather than all of them at once. This half and half system that Mario Odyssey uses also allows the designers to add more complicated and difficult objectives. The reason for this is that in games with open pacing, you kind of want each challenge to have a similar difficulty, because a player can tackle them in any order, and you don't want someone's first obstacle to be the hardest one. But with a half and half system, you can make the challenges in the second wave more difficult, because you know for certain that a player has to complete other objectives first. The way that Mario Odyssey does it is great, but it's quite simple. If you wanted to take it even further, you could do the Bowser's Fury method. In this game, each stage is split into multiple diverse areas, which are kind of like smaller levels within the level. Each area itself is completely linear and has ultra clean pacing, and they're pretty short. You can clear one out in a couple of minutes. But the trick is, whenever you beat a new area, all the ones you have already completed refill with new enemies and items. This is a very smart way to get the control that linear design offers without sacrificing the freedom that you want in a sandbox game, because each of the zones is linear, so you have the control, but the player still has the choice and the freedom to go in between the areas in any order that they like. This actually changes the problem. Now, rather than making the objectives flow together, you have to make the areas flow together, which is why Bowser's Fury only ever presents the player with 3 or 4 areas at a time, and why they're clumped so close together on the map. Finally, you can do it the way Hollow Knight does it, which is with keys. Parts of the map are locked off to the player, but one of the things you're able to collect is keys, which allow you to open up these locked areas. By letting the player see a locked off area, you really incentivize them to explore more in order to find the key which opens it up and gives them access. But Hollow Knight takes this keys and lock system to another level, because the items it gives the player aren't just keys, they're whole new movement abilities, which allow the player to traverse the world in an entirely new way. Hollow Knight is only able to do this because it has so many tools. It's not something that Celeste is able to replicate, because it just doesn't have the quantity to give them out to the player like Hollow Knight does. But what Celeste does have is a ton of interactable objects that you could give the player access to in the same way that Hollow Knight does with new tools. If you place these interactable objects around your map as paths into new areas, you could use them as gates by having them be turned off until the player gets a key. Celeste actually already does this in the second level, where the star blocks that you can move through are turned off and they act like regular ground until you go over and interact with his mirror, and then they go back to working as normal. If you had spots like this all over your level with deactivated objects, then it could really incentivize the player to explore in the same way that Hollow Knight does. Video over. Like, subscribe. Ugh.